last days, it's been suggested that there is one last paradox that has to be solved or resolved before we can experience and know what is called liberation, realization, and so forth. And over these days, the stories told have been to bring the possibility of that we can discover what those two sides of the coin are, like those that have been reconciled before, stillness and movement, and emptiness and fullness. But perhaps instead we should be looking at or exploring what it is that brings this together, so there's no longer a paradox for us, just like we experienced when stillness and movement came together, or emptiness and fullness. So there are several little stories that might allow us to come to recognize what this is. The first is a story about a king who, with his queen, every year would gather together some troubadours or some performers who would enact one of the folkloric stories of the times. But there was one occasion when the play that was to be put on required a small girl of 5 years old. But there was no one in the palace of this age. But the queen said, "Our son, Aiesha, is 5 years old, and if we dressed him as a girl, he could fulfill the part that is needed to be played." So indeed this is what happened, and the play was a very great success. And Aiesha was such a beautiful girl that the king and the queen decided to have a portrait painted of him dressed as this 5-year-old girl performer. Now the years passed, and Aiesha grew to be a handsome and virile young prince. But one day, when he was roaming about the palace, he happened to come upon a room, and when he opened the door, there were lots of things that were there, including the painting of him in his costume. And when he looked at the painting and saw the deity, saw that this young maiden would be about his own age. But he fell in love with this painting. And he went to his parents and he told them that he would not marry anyone else but the young girl in that painting. But there was an old servant in the employ who had been with them for many years, and he took the young prince down to the storeroom and stood him before the painting, and he said, "My dear Aiesha, can you not see that you have fallen in love with yourself?" And the second story is that story again of the king who had an only daughter, Aiesha, she was called, and she was a most beautiful maiden. But the king, not wanting anyone to cast lustful eyes on her, had a tall tower erected in the middle of a river, and Aiesha was placed in that tower, living the lonely and forlorn life of an isolate. Only the servants and the various diversions that were given to females at the time, sewing, embroidery, and so forth, to keep her occupied. But one day she heard the sound of singing. So she went out onto her balcony and looked down just as a young fisherman was rowing his boat up the river, singing perhaps a fishing ballad that those people of those times had learned for long ages. But at the same moment that Aiesha noticed the fisherman who was called Rabat, looked up and saw in the tall tower a maiden. And of course we can glean what happened. He immediately was smitten, fell in love. So from that day on, when he rowed his boat up the river, he sang, but his songs changed. Instead of singing the ballads of the fishermen, he began to sing songs of love and longing. And every day Aiesha would come out and listen as his voice wafted up into the tall tower, and she would send down rose petals to him to show a sign of her reciprocated love for him. But Aiesha languished. That love and longing brought her to be pale and thin. And she spoke to her father, the king, about this, and said she'd fallen in love with this fisherman and wanted to be wed with him. Well, the king, seeing the pallid state of his daughter and concerned about it, thought that perhaps it was time that she was wed. So he decided to bring the fisherman to him and offer the hand of his princess to him. But when the young man was brought in front of the king, he was found to be the ugliest of men. Now, even though the king saw his physical ugliness, he thought that perhaps that which they had between them would enable his princess to find the happiness that she so longed for. But when he was brought before her, she was abhorred, shocked, and repelled by his physical appearance. So the wedding, the union, did not take place. And Rabat, even though every day he rowed his boat, singing songs of lament, he faded away and died. He was buried along the banks of the river, and his fishing boat moored in that place where he was interred. Aiesha herself continued to languish, pale, with a heart heavy. But then one day the king was out in one of his gondolas, going along the river, when he noticed the small fishing boat. And knowing the story, of course, it having been put abroad of what had happened to Rabat, he took his gondola over to where the fishing boat was moored. And there, when he looked at this place, at this boat, he found that what had formed in its bottom looked like a stone of great brilliance. How it came there he didn't know or could not conjecture, but taking that stone, he had it fashioned into a cup, which he gave to Aiesha. Now a strange thing happened. Whenever Aiesha brought this cup to her lips, the sound of Rabat's voice came lilting in her ears. And with this experience came the recognition that what Rabat's song contained was his true essence, his true heart. But her languishing also, with this recognition, brought a deep, deep sadness. So she too passed away. Her father, the king, although not a greatly enlightened man, did recognize something. So he had the beautiful Aiesha brought to the place where Rabat was buried, and had these two brought together in that place. From this there grew a tree in the place that they were both laid. A tree arose, and it was discovered that although the fruit of that tree was very ugly, its essence was tasting like the nectar of the gods. These two sides of the coin, like stillness and movement. How were they reconciled? And what do these stories tell us without even having clarified what this enigma, this paradox is that brings them together, unites them, and brings for us what is called liberation, realization. What do these stories tell us? What is it that brings the coin together, reconciles this paradox?